The Vikings. Who were they? Most people will tell you that the Vikings were savage warriors from Scandinavia who came across the seas in the Dark Ages to raid and to rape and to steal. Is this actually true? Well, kind of, yes. But many people will also argue that they were also settlers, farmers, traders, craftsmen. Perhaps the best way to view the Vikings is as Scandinavians who, for various reasons and motivations, migrated out of Scandinavia between the 8th and 11th centuries for various different purposes. In modern movies and TV, they've been immortalised as savage warriors, fierce in battle, but also noble of heart, wanting to die with a sword in their hand. This is very much the Victorian or 19th century ideal of the Germanic warrior. This ties in with the ideas of the noble savage of the period, and the idea that these kind of simple, pagan, pre-modern, pure warriors were somehow more ideal than the modern man. It was a very male-centric and also sort of heroic and fantasy idea of the pre-Christian warrior. And yet at the same time it fits in with the Christian ideals of the time and very much goes hand in hand with stories of King Arthur and St. George killing the dragon. But does this romanticised view of Vikings bear any closeness to the truth? What we can deal with are the historical sources and the archaeology that's been left to us. And admittedly, the history that was written down was biased. The Vikings themselves left almost nothing in terms of written records. So therefore our view of the Vikings or the Scandinavian invaders or migrants is very much based on the English, Frankish and German and Italian sources that are left to us describing these people. And inevitably different sources don't describe the same types of people because there are many types of people who were Vikings or what we would now call Vikings. Some of them were indeed raiders, some of them were indeed soldiers and conquerors, but others were simply settlers, some of them were traders and craftsmen. So where were these Vikings from? Well, fundamentally Scandinavia. They were Scandinavians. That is principally Denmark, Sweden and Norway. Partly due to the geography of Europe, Denmark, Sweden and Norway being on the fringes, on the outskirts of Latin-influenced Europe, had not been brought into the Roman Empire at all, and they'd not been Christianized, so these were still pagan lands. At the beginning of the so-called Viking Age in the 8th century, what is now Denmark, Sweden and Norway were very much still very pagan and old Germanic cultures. This meant that not only in geographical and resource terms, but also in cultural terms, they butted up against the lands which they were next to. They contrasted quite starkly in cultural terms with, for example, the Frankish lands to the south or the Anglo-Saxon lands to the west. Indeed, Charlemagne during his wars had converted the Saxon people from their pagan beliefs to Christianity by the sword. He hadn't converted them with the book, he had converted them with fire and blade. Some people have even argued that this cultural friction was one of the causes for the beginning of the Viking Age. The idea that the Danes, with what are now the German lands to their south, with Christianity on their borders and seeing the Saxon people converted by the sword, were indeed expanding on a military basis. This theory certainly bears some investigation, but it seems somewhat of a stretch because the earliest Viking activity that we know of seemed to take very much the framework of raids rather than a military campaign in any coordinated sense. Nevertheless, for whatever reason, in the 8th century the people of Scandinavia started expanding outwards. In very general and loose terms, the people of Denmark seem to have focused their attentions on the British Isles and northern France. The people of what's now Sweden seem to have travelled down the rivers into Russia, and the people of what is now Norway seem to have focused their attentions on the northern and outer edges of the British Isles, so Scotland and Northern Ireland as well as Northern England, and indeed on expanding as far as you can go westwards across the sea to the Americas. Now the word Viking is problematic. In modern English, for example, we commonly refer to all people from this period from Scandinavia as Vikings. This is fundamentally probably wrong. It's probably the safest assumption to say that the term Viking is best applied to someone who travels or raids out of Scandinavia, not someone who simply lives peacefully in Scandinavia. But even that term is fraught with difficulties. One possible explanation for the word Viking comes from the word vik, which means an inlet or small bay. So therefore, one theory has it that the term Viking simply means someone who sails around in a boat. Another theory is that the word Viking might be related to an area in Norway known as Viken or Viken. Over the years there have been various other theories for where the word Viking comes from, but what's notable is that in Old English the word first appears in an Anglo-Saxon poem called Widsith. This poem, Widsith, does indeed date to the 9th century, so is from the period when the so-called Vikings were a big problem in England, when the Great Army was invading. And in later English sources, indeed, the term Viking does generally seem to be applied to raiders from Scandinavia. So basically what we would class as modern Vikings. However, what's notable is that if we look at mainstream sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the invaders are almost always referred to as Danes. Very occasionally they're referred to as Norse or Northmen, but Danes being the primary invader of Britain, certainly in the English language, within the so-called Viking Age, within the period of Viking invasions, it is the Danes who get referred to the most. So for a 9th century English person, if you wanting to refer to a Viking, they normally would have just said a Dane. And we should also note that all of the Christian nations often simply refer to these people as pagans or heathens, because to them that's what they were. They were non-Christian invaders. In more recent times, a lot of historians and archaeologists have gone to great efforts to paint the so-called Vikings as not simply invaders and marauders and pirates, but also as settlers, as farmers, as craftspeople. That's certainly true and very important to acknowledge. Several major cities throughout Europe, west and east, were established by these settlers. They were much more than just pirates and raiders. They were also conquerors, they were also settlers, farmers, and they did establish entire cultures. However, while emphasizing these things, we should never forget that one of the characterizing features of the so-called Viking Age is one of invasion, conquest, and raiding. We also shouldn't separate raiding from invasion or war. With a modern mindset, we tend to think of raiding as something that criminals do and war as something that governments do, but it simply wasn't like this in the so-called Dark Ages. Throughout the ancient and medieval periods, it was completely normal for raiding to be part of war, and in fact you could say the majority of wars consisted of raiding. We could perhaps separate raiding conducted by small warlords or local chieftains from raiding that was state-sponsored, but the fact is that raiding was something that all tribal groupings did against each other. We see it everywhere in the world throughout human history, and raiding was the smallest scale part of warfare as far as these people were concerned. So when we first hear about the Vikings attacking Lindisfarne in 793 and attacking the monastery and going away with goods and slaves, we don't know whether that was part of a coordinated declaration of war or whether it was simply a raiding for goods. Even if we look at the separate kingdoms of England, for example, at the time, England consisted of not one unified country as such, but a series of kingdoms: Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Northumbria, and these different kingdoms were warring against each other, and it was very common for them to make alliances, one or two of them against another one, or larger alliances, and sometimes the Scots and the Cornish and the Welsh and the Irish got involved as well, and they were all fighting each other, and a lot of this fighting would have involved raiding across borders, stealing goods and stealing people, and we have to remember that slavery was completely normal and prevalent across Northern Europe at this point. This was normal for the time. So while accepting that the so-called Vikings were indeed traders and settlers and farmers, we must also remember they were also warriors, just like many other cultures in Europe at the time, but they were very, very effective at it. Now, the reputation of Vikings isn't an entirely modern one. They were indeed rated very highly as fighters during the period, and we know, for example, that the Varangian Guard were made up predominantly of Scandinavians, and the Byzantine emperors kept this as a personal bodyguard. And we know that they were also fairly effective in war. They were very good at what we would now call hit and run tactics. Some people could even describe it as guerrilla warfare. When fighting in both England and France, or what are now known as England and France, they weren't at the time, their typical manner of attack when raiding was to sail up rivers, attack a settlement, or in some cases a monastery or abbey or such like, and then to quickly get away again without having to engage the local armed forces. Now, this is actually a really important point to recognise, because one of the reasons that they were very effective, and at least in the early days not very often defeated, was because they didn't generally get into combat with standing armies. Throughout Europe at the period, it was normal for kings to take some time to raise an army. They simply weren't well equipped to be able to instantly deploy soldiers, to travel quickly to a place where Vikings were raiding and fight those Vikings. They simply couldn't do that in the time available. So these raiding Scandinavians quickly realised that they could sail up rivers, attack a settlement or monastery or somewhere else with things worth stealing, and indeed people worth taking slaves, and attack it and get away quickly in their boats. And because of the nature of the construction of their ships, which were relatively quick and light, they could very often get in and out quicker than any opposing naval forces could catch them. And in some cases there is even a theory that they transported ships across land as well. Where did these Vikings have the biggest effect? Well, I think most people will agree that the two areas where they probably had the greatest and most fundamental effect on the nations were England and what is now France. In France, the Scandinavian invaders essentially established the Norman dynasty, which William the Conqueror was descended from. But much earlier than that, the Viking raids on Francia or France had meant that Charlemagne had to build fortifications, he had to build a navy and an administrative structure, and indeed create military bureaucracy such that he could raise forces quickly enough to oppose these raids. In England, we could say that the effect was even more profound than this. Ultimately, England did fall to Canute, to Scandinavian kingship, and it had nearly fallen under Alfred the Great's time. In 865, the Great Horde, or Great Danish Army, invaded, and it nearly defeated all of the English forces pitted against it. Alfred the Great managed to hold out, regroup, come back, and ultimately to force a stalemate with the Danes, such that England became divided into two halves. What became essentially an enlarged kingdom of Wessex to the south under Anglo-Saxon rulership under Alfred himself, and to the north the Danelaw. In the Danelaw, the areas under Danish control, there was a lot of transference of culture, in language for example, even things like our word for Thursday from Thor's Day, and even perhaps local dialects and accents. But ultimately, under Alfred's sons and grandsons, this led to the formation of what became the Kingdom of England. Formerly, England had been made up of a series of smaller kingdoms who'd been constantly at war with each other. But due to the Danish threat, the English kingdoms were forced to merge together and become one kingdom. So we could ultimately argue that England owes its very existence as one nation to the Viking invasions. Even if we look later on, if we look at the Bayeux Tapestry for example, we see a very notable type of soldier fighting on the English side, who wields a large two-handed axe. These were Harold's housecarls. Housecarls themselves were a personal bodyguard, much like the Byzantine emperor's Varangian Guard. These bodyguards and their characteristic two-handed axes had been a Danish introduction, but they had been retained under subsequent English kingship under Edward and Harold because they were a very effective fighting force, and undoubtedly by this point they weren't necessarily all Scandinavians, perhaps none of them were Scandinavians. It's entirely possible that they were all ethnically English, or indeed mixed race, mixed English with Scandinavian. We have to remember that many of these Scandinavians who came and settled then mixed with the local population, to the point where we can't necessarily by the 11th century differentiate between English and Danes or English and Norse. Most historians agree that the Kievan Rus were Vikings, and that the Vikings had a huge impact on the foundation of what's now Russia and Belarus. There is nevertheless some controversy over this, and some people argue that the Rus were in fact Slavs. We're not going to go into that here, but certainly it's very interesting that we know that the Scandinavians had an effect on the development of Eastern Europe, and to this day many historians and archaeologists believe that they were founders of some of the cities which are now in Eastern Europe. Most people argue that it's probably likely that the Rus themselves were a ruling elite from Scandinavia, probably Sweden, and that definitely the bulk of the population was Slavs, but perhaps much like in Normandy, there was a ruling elite made up of Vikings. And in case it's not obvious, we should definitely note that the name Russia and Belarus take their names from the word Rus, which we're assuming here relates to Viking invaders. It should come as no surprise that a culture based so heavily around seafaring and fishing and the sea did rely heavily on ships, and in fact this was of course one of the intrinsic factors behind the success of the Vikings in raiding foreign lands. The Scandinavians of the period had several different types of ship available to them, but the most famous one, and the one which most Vikings would have gone raiding in, was the longship. The longship, as the name might suggest, has a long and quite narrow hull, and it's quite shallow, which means that it can land in quite shallow water, it can go up rivers, it can go places where some heavier and deeper boats simply can't go. These ships are overall quite light for their size as well, and fast, and all of these things make them excellent raiding vessels. One of the most iconic things about these longships is of course the figureheads that we find on the front of them sometimes archaeologically, a very famous one from the Oseberg ship for example. Vikings are also to some extent quite famed for their arms and armour, for their weapons. Surprisingly, we don't know that much about what types of armour they wore. We know that they used mail or chainmail in some cases, but it seems that this was probably limited to the most wealthy Vikings. We also know surprisingly little about the helmets worn by the Vikings, some people even suggesting that not that many Vikings had access to helmets or chose not to wear them. But on balance, it seems probably that the Vikings used very, very similar armour to all of the people that they would have been interacting with. So for example, Danes fighting in England would have been wearing almost identical armour and equipment to the English that they were fighting against. Very similar helmets of a Spangenhelm construction most of the time, and mail shirts if they could get access to them. It also seems that Viking shields were fundamentally similar to British and Frankish shields. There is some suggestion that lenticular or domed shields were more common by the Viking era in England and France, whereas the Scandinavian nations were still probably using larger, flatter shields. But nevertheless, they shared very similar construction methods, being made of wooden planks and having a central iron boss in which the handle was. These are known as boss-gripped shields, and these predate the type of strapped shields that we see on the Bayeux Tapestry. Indeed, the swords that the Vikings used were equally very, very similar, and in many cases actually from France, England and the other countries that they were so heavily interacting with. We know for a fact that many Viking swords actually feature blades which were made in Germany. We also find almost exactly the same, or in some cases precisely the same styles of sword, which we have typologies for and which are generally classed by the hilt type in this period, because most of the blades were very similar. We find exactly the same hilt types, for example, in Norway as we do in northern England. Now this could of course mean that these invading Norwegians were bringing their swords with them and leaving them in England, or selling them to people in England, or it could be the other way around. It could be that these are English swords that are being taken back to Norway. Or, yet again, it could simply be that the people of Norway and the people of northern England were making swords in the same style because they were interacting so much together. We simply don't know, and in many cases it may have been all of the above. The blades could have been traded in from Germany, the hilts could have been made locally and then traded from that place in both directions. And we should never forget that the predominant weapon right the way across Europe in this period was the spear, and we can find exactly the same spear types in Scandinavia as we find all over the rest of Europe, and indeed they were probably traded in all directions. Many people have debated why the Viking Age came to an end. Probably it's down to lots of different factors. Climatic factors have been cited, but probably more likely or more of an effect than that was the fact that the Scandinavian lands gradually started to adopt Christianity. In addition to this, the way that slavery functioned changed in society with the coming of Christianity, as the church encouraged people to not take slaves from other Christian societies. Probably also the simple fact that the Scandinavian countries were coming within the Catholic sphere meant that there was a greater pressure to not be in a constant state of raiding or war with their neighbours, and trade started to become more enticing than necessarily raiding and war. One of the last great Viking invasions was under Harald Hardrada in 1066. Harold Godwinson's army, which had been preparing for the invasion of William of Normandy, had to race north and fight at Stamford Bridge. It was a crushing defeat for Harold Hardrada's army. Hardrada's army should have been well equipped, well trained, highly motivated, and would have been a real force to be reckoned with. But the fact that Harold Godwinson's army crushed it is really not to be overlooked in the effect that it would have had on any future thoughts about invading England, for example. In addition to this, of course, William the Conqueror's rule of England was absolutely cast iron and very, very strong. And with his building of a series of castles around the country and his general militarisation and tight grip on England, it would have made probably any thoughts about future invasion, at least for the next few decades, completely out of the question. But aside from military factors, it was probably cultural changes within Scandinavia and undoubtedly the Christianisation of Scandinavia which spelled the gradual end of the Viking era. We do in fact still continue to see small-scale Norwegian raids on Britain and Ireland into the 12th century, but generally speaking we can say that the Viking era came to an end in the 11th century. So from the 8th to the 11th century, the Scandinavians produced these people who've become known as Vikings, and they left an absolutely indelible mark on the history of Europe, on its institutions, its military structures, its actual architectural structures, its building of navies, and the way that Europe interacted with each other and in some cases coordinated to deal with external threats. Beyond that, the Vikings also left their art, their language and other elements of their culture, and of course their genetics. Viking DNA can be found all over Europe. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon and you can follow us on Facebook.